My name is Leonid Mojdzhes. I'm a lecturer from Institute of Business and Design in Moscow, Russia, although physically I'm currently living in Tbilisi, Georgia for, let's say, different reasons. In my presentation, I want to discuss the cultural reasons behind the mainstream approach of Russian video game industry to making historical or quasi-historical, fantasy-historical video games. Because of the lack of time, I unfortunately won't be able to cover a lot of specific video games. Instead, I will try to discuss the ideology influencing the representation of history in digital media in Russia in general, using particular games more as an example. Russian video games, which address history, are part of Russian video game industry in general, obviously, and importantly, they represent a particular approach, even way of thinking about themselves, which influence many decisions of Russian game designers, journalists, and players. This approach can be called the "our answer" rhetoric. I will explain what I mean. This discourse paints a picture of a dialogue/competition between the Russian and Western industry, with Western industry understood as AAA or AA games made for personal computers. This ideology of dialogue/competition with Western industry implies and promotes the idea that we can do everything they can do, and we should do everything they can do. Among a lot of Russian game developers and players and journalists, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. This idea inspires two somewhat contradictory tendencies, especially influencing historical games. On the one hand, developers often use Western games and their traditions as a sort of blueprints for their project, viewing the resemblance in fundamental game mechanics and produced experience as a guarantee of quality. Games are supposed to play Western. This doesn't mean that Russian video games are fundamentally unoriginal. After all, different forms of copying are basically unavoidable and helpful in every creative venue. But many video games openly state, even highlight as part of, for example, their marketing strategies, their mechanical resemblance to Western project. And this mechanical resemblance is viewed as something good. And those Western games themselves are often framed as theses in need of an answer, like a West made something and we need to answer that. We need to provide some sort of a reaction. Just to be clear, to the left, this will be a constant format in my presentation. To the left, you can see a very famous Western game. To the right, you can see our answer to it from Russia, like Atom RPG, King's Bounty, and so on and so forth. You will see this logic later. Those answers, in effect, are achieved by including narrative and especially visual aesthetic aimed at creating a resonance between the game and imagery and tropes popular in Russian culture. The explicit goal of many projects is to encode a certain level of Russianness or Sovietness in their games while maintaining gameplay similarity to Western games. Two currently developing projects exemplify this approach. Atomic Heart, and I cannot believe, I mean, look at those guys. They really didn't put all that much thought in the visual aesthetic. In terms of originality. Atomic Heart is often described as Russian Bioshock. It copies a lot of elements from Bioshock while recreating its visual aesthetics in Soviet style, and somewhat infamous Smuta, a bit weird project, which are supposed to look as a Russian Assassin's Creed, but we have some problems with believing in this. Both games use historical or pseudo-historical settings, which is quite a natural choice, considering the difference between visual aesthetics of chosen periods in Russia and in the West, and familiarity of Russian with historical imagery. Basically, it is easy to encode Russianness through historical visuality. And third important tendency is a desire of Russian game developers to avoid any overt political messages. In order to achieve this, developers are actually ready to sacrifice the resemblance of their narrative with traditional historical narratives on history. For example, Soviet narratives for understanding the World War II can be deformed or forgotten, and the necessary level of Russianness in the case of including World War II in video games is achieved through aesthetic familiarity only, through visuals, basically. While it is tempting to blame this last tendency on Russian government censorship or self-censorship associated with it, I believe that the situation has more to do with general problems in Russian humanitarian education and even bigger dominance of people from STEM in Russian game development than in the West. Many games created by combining Western game mechanics with imagery and narrative supposed to encode Russianness without any clear political agenda produce surprisingly problematic and convoluted statements about history. Atomic Heart is a good example here. In this project, a player assumes the role of literal KGB agent without the game making any comments on, to say the least, problematic role of this organization in Russian history. And the reason behind this has more to do with the genre of the game than with any conscious political decisions. Sovietedness or Russianness, collective imagery of Soviet times lacks any figure of independent individuals trained and allowed to use arms, like Private Detective from, for example, BioShock Infinite. So the decision to use a member of secret police as a main character in the game built around shooter mechanics, supporting the story of a single hero fighting hordes of enemies appeared natural to developers. Any ideological misgivings are simply ignored or deflected by claiming that, come on, this is only a game. The resulting game unconsciously produces a very problematic statement, with the player assuming the role of government agent directly tasked with crushing the rebellion of oppressed creatures, in that case robots. Importantly, this narrative does not resonate with popular Soviet narratives, including popular Soviet narrative glorifying its police and secret services, since that glorification, older glorification, was done differently. Similar process of unconsciously creating a new understanding of Russian history, and often very problematic understanding of Russian history, can be seen in the most popular Russian game of genre of historical video games, real-time strategies. Oh my God. Real-time strategies like Blitzkrieg series and Partisans 9041. Their developers combine the desire to make a game procedurally resembling Western projects. Partisans are directly compared to Commando, a very popular game in Russia in the late 90s. And they combine this game mechanics with inclusion of imagery, once again, encoding Russianness and Sovietness, and the attempts to make the game about World War II as non-political as possible. And the resulting projects promote an imperialistic, sometimes even, well, fascist understanding of war as conflict between morally, well, neutral forces, in which the strongest one shall prevail through strength of arms and overwhelming resources, gaining moral justification for this victory from the simple logic is either us or them. Once again, this understanding of history, this understanding of World War II differs strongly from Soviet understanding of World War II, focused mostly on the suffering of common people and soldiers and supposedly moral and political superiority of USSR over its enemies. And I do understand that talking to a gathering of people from Eastern Europe about the moral superiority of USSR and especially the Red Army over basically anything may sound a bit provocative. However, I want to emphasize here that Russian historical games do not reevaluate history in comparison to older media, for example, vilifying communism or glorifying Christian orthodoxy. On the contrary, many game developers and players would actually view themselves and their project as part of a single tradition stemming from previous older media to modern video games. Without understanding that they are actually promoting a completely new approach to understanding, for example, World War II or different historical periods in general, and their approach is often very problematic. This situation stems from reasons I mentioned above. Popular Western video games do not provide mechanics for example, to present suffering of civilians in the war, a fact already thoroughly discussed in the research on RTEs and shooter genres. And Russian ambitions to create our answer to Western project force game developers to adapt those Western mechanics, deforming narratives of their own culture and in the process creating new ones. I think we don't have the time, so I will just skip one game I wanted to discuss as a sort of example of different approach, and we'll just come to this project, which I recommend highly. Black Book is a project by Studio Martoshka. Technically, it is an RPG about a village witch with combat mechanics organized around a type of collectible card game. It is a historical game, which I think is interesting because it steps away from all three tendencies I mentioned previously. First of all, it does not position itself as an answer to any particular and popular game from the West. In fact, its combination of game mechanics are quite original, although obviously they are influenced by the surge of virtual collectible card games like The Elder Scrolls Legends or Gwent from the Witcher series. Secondly, while Black Book strongly resonates with imagery encoding Russianness, it contradicts many popular assumptions and conventions about Russian history and what living in the Russia in the late 19th century was like. For example, it presents historical Russia as a complex and multi-ethnical conglomerate of different religions and folk traditions, and pays a particular attention to the life of peasants, a popular theme in Russian literature, which became increasingly ignored in the last decades, especially in Russian video games. Moreover, while Black Book does not directly offer to play as a member of colonized people, like previous game from Martoshka Studio, Muzman, it does give them a voice in the narrative without either patronizing colonized Finno-Ugric populace of Perm region or exoticizing them, an almost unprecedented decision in modern Russian pop culture, usually preoccupied by military conflict between powerful empires, which naturally excludes relatively peaceful and technologically underdeveloped tribes of Permian natives, well, underdeveloped for their time. And thirdly, Black Book does not shy away from the political messages, possibly because the very idea of focusing the video game on one single region, including both its Slavic and non-Slavic inhabitants, is already political by itself. So, I mean, what the hell? Different chapters include comments made both procedurally and narratively on Soviet regime, industrial capitalist economy, and
Leonid, sorry for interrupting you, but please bear in mind that you have 14 more minutes. So
okay,
just
sorry,
distribute your time accordingly.
Yep. What I just wanted to come to is that relative success of Black Book in Russia emphasize the fact that problems of historical games made in Russia has their roots in almost deliberate self-provincialization of the Russian game industry, its inner ideology, and not in the specific ideological inclination of players in development, like their conscious desire to make militaristic or imperialistic games. Whether this is good or bad, I actually do not know, because maybe if those people actually believed in imperialism, they would be easier to view the world differently. But again, sorry for taking so much of the time, and if you're interested, I will be glad to answer any particular questions after the panel. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, I have no presentation at all. I suppose my report will be relatively short and purely oral. It will be also a kind of theoretical report, so unfortunately I have no presentation. I'm a professional historian medievalist, and my interest for the game studies is rather not typical for Russian historians. In our country, much more active in that area by now are philosophers, culturologists. So my report is more of a case study, a study of a peculiar community of Russian historians interested in the phenomenon of video games. I'm a medievalist, a specialist in Italian and German history from Lomonosov Moscow State University, Anastasia Anufrieva, and also I'm interested in the area of the game studies and at all how professional historians in Russia are working in the area of game studies can be shown first of all on the material related to the Middle Ages. And this is not just because of the massive spread of images and decorations of medieval worlds in video games, whether they are close to reality or to fantasy. Very important is that in Soviet Russia was formed very specific school of medieval West European history studies. Medievalists at the Soviet historical faculties were a kind of special case, somewhat different from the other. Many of them were standing apart from the official ideologized course, and such relative freedom was possible since the subject was considered far from reality by politicians, by superiors, and so on. So the position of Soviet medievalists to the object of study could be called a kind of escapism. Maybe it was a try of an escape into the world of the imaginary, magnificent medieval West at a time when the real West was almost unachievable because of the Iron Curtain. Ironically, such a look from afar not only imposed significant limitations for the researchers, but also gave some advantages. The strong sensation of a distance between historian and his object of study led to a deeper theoretical reflection on the methodology. Of particular interest to some of the Soviet medievalists were the ideas of postmodernists, doubting the very possibility to gain reliable knowledge of the past through the prism of historical sources. One of the most prominent followers of that trend was Mikhail Boytsov, a medievalist Germanist who taught and created his own scientific school in the Lomonosov Moscow State University, and then in the Higher School of Economics, where he also recently, for several years, was the dean of the Faculty of Humanities. So he was important not only for historians, but also for philosophers and other humanitarian areas. So some Soviet medievalists were, so to say, in the avant-garde of the methodological and historiosophical reflection in the area. And in the post-Soviet context, that reflection of medievalists about historians' view of the past through the prism of sources gradually developed into a broader interest to the mechanisms of perception of the medieval past, not only in the academic society, but also in the popular culture. Yes, but through the prism of different media. Historian medievalists played a significant role in the formation of the sphere of public history in Russia. They initiated first big conferences and significant publications on this topic, and they provide its integration into teaching at Russian universities. For example, mentioned above, Lomonosov Moscow State University and Higher School of Economics and some others. The area of game studies was especially productive for that theoretical reflection, for that investigation, because of it was possible a comparison. The game mechanics defining gamers' perception of the past were an especially interesting object for comparison with methodological approaches defining the perception of a historian. So it's like a parallel. Which way is transforming our perception of the past because of the mechanics or because of our methodological approaches? Based on what that mechanics or that methodological approaches are formed? Do the historiographical concepts influence the image of the Middle Ages in the video games? Yes, to a large extent, this is so. For example, the Marxist theory of the social economical formations influenced the image of the medieval economy in the strategic games. The ideas of the history of mentalities were reflected in the construction of the game environment, for example, in RPG. A kind of impact had also postmodernist deconstruction of unachievable medieval past. It was reflected on the one hand in the fantasy games, and on the other hand in some real historical games with elements of the self-ironical parody underlining of the historical inaccuracy of a game. But at the same time, historians understand how important it is to study which way the mass culture influence their own scientific comprehension of the past, how the popular culture transforms the context and even the very meaning of their work. Of course, self-reflection is very important here. What did it mean for the Soviet historians, imaginary medieval West? And what does it mean nowadays for the Russian gamers? Is it an idealized picture or an image of the dark Middle Ages, dark West, and so on? Is it rather a historical documentary or a fairy tale when we are playing, when we are trying to immerse in that medieval world through the game or through our historical investigations, academical historical investigation? Do we want and are we capable to immerse into that world? To what extent and in which moment our idea of the real past becomes a fiction? What mechanisms do we use trying to reconstruct or maybe deconstruct historical reality? All these questions seems to us critically important, and they are very important both to the academical medieval studies and to the medieval game studies, so to say. Such synthesis between medieval and game studies nowadays is represented in Russia primarily in university teaching, in lectures and seminars, students' graduate works, and etc. Some publications of Russian historians connected with medieval game studies could be characterized as rather superficial and even naive, full of positivist spirit. They criticize medieval game worlds for unauthenticity, inaccuracy of historical details, and so on, without realizing the importance of these inaccuracies, the gaps between the fiction and reality as an important source for information. It's like a philosopher's stone capable to turn to turn fiction into reality, reality into fiction, and that's a set of the questions is interesting for our relatively small and forming society. And of course, there is significant difference between elder and younger generations of Russian medievalists in their attitude to the medieval game studies. For the most of the elder, this area is perceived at best like a
Anastasia,
kind of
sorry, maybe you could wrap up the presentation. If you have something to say, so could you please just wrap it up?
Sorry, I don't have no presentation at all.
No. I mean, could you come to the conclusions?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes, thank you. For the most of the elder generation, this area is perceived at best like a kind of entertainment or educational activity aimed to attracting the interest of a wider audience, or even as a waste of time, unacceptable for a serious historian. But me and some of my younger colleagues, we see the direct connection and continuity between the methodological searches of Soviet medievalists and the problems of the interactions with imaginary medieval West in video games nowadays. And we hope to continue the studies. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Alexander Vetushinsky. I work at Lomonosov Moscow State University at Institute of Business and Design. First of all, of course, I would like to thank you for invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you today, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk with you about Russian video games, history, and culture. My brief paper will be devoted to how Russians speak and write about history of Russian video games. In other words, it's not about systematization of historical facts, not about history, but about their interpretation. The main, but not the only, of course, sources of my paper are two books on the history of Russian video games published in Russia in 2018 and 2020. So far, these are the only books on the subject, but as I know, two more are being written right now. So we can say that quite a lot of attention has been paid to the history of Russian video games in the last years. At the same time, I think it's important to talk a little bit about it. There is no signs of any museumification of them. They are only museums of Soviet arcade machines. And of course, it's a very good museums with a lot of useful information, but computer or console games, of course, Russian too, have not yet been specially preserved or exhibited in Russia, not yet. However, this doesn't prevent us from talking about them and their history. By the way, I need to note that these are not entirely new thoughts. I have been talking about this for several years. Moreover, this is written in my book published in 2021 in Russia. 2021, yeah. However, today all this sounds especially acute. And I really think that the history of video games in Russia should be spoken differently, that it is now accepted. That is, a radical deconstruction of the established narrative is needed. Without it, it's not a history, but mythology. Here are the three main points that make the accepted history of Russian video games extremely unreliable. First, ideologization. Second, self-colonization. Third, mythologization. Okay, let's go. The ideological aspect is associated with implicit imperialism. Even in a book written by a Russian author who has been living in the United States quite a long time, not only Russian, but also Ukrainian and Belarusian games are called Russian, ours, or domestic, fatherland games. For example, in both books, World of Tanks and Stalker considered as Russian. As a result, the very phrase Russian game simply loses its meaning, becoming a synonym for video games in the post-Soviet space. And although the countries of the former Soviet Union do have common features, of course, the gaming industry in all of them appears only after the collapse of USSR. In Russia, for example, the gaming industry was born only in the 1990s. Therefore, instead of studying the key differences between the various Russian schools of video game design and development, Russia is a big country, and not all games are made in Moscow or St. Petersburg, of course. Journalists, bloggers, or ordinary people work with a term Russian games that does not make sense, because it's all games from a post-Soviet countries. The second point is self-colonization. The fact is that one of the organizing narrative is the presence of golden era in history of Russian video games. So we have three stages: pre-golden era, 1990s, a golden era until the crisis of 28, and post-golden era after the crisis of 28. But here's the problem. The golden era is a period when Russian video games start to become popular abroad. That is, not only the way of description came from an already existing narratives, the golden era from history of arcade games, but the most important period is a period when it was supposedly possible to prove that Russian games are no worse, but maybe even better than games from abroad. Leonid Mojdzhes has already spoken about it. The third point is mythologization. Those who now write about the history of Russian video games, in fact, mythologize it, simply because they try to focus only on the best and most important games made in Russia, without really reflecting on what exactly they stand out for. Sometimes it's successful game, sometimes original, sometimes just big, and sometimes it's just an ambitious game that didn't even come out. It's really interesting case. But the problem is that there were not so many such games, while there were plenty of games coming out. Maybe not so original, not so popular, not so big, and no one really studies them. Both books pretend that only good Russian games exist. The only exception is Ladder Racing Club, whose case reproduced the extraterrestrial story, so in some way it's too external narrative. Therefore, it's not surprising that the Russian internet is full of materials about the worst games ever made in Russia. But the point is not to exclude the bad or exclude the good, but to understand how it all coexisted with each other. It seems to me that it's important to understand these 3 points in order to be able to start writing a completely new history of the Russian gaming industry and Russian video games, a story that does not throw heterogeneous phenomena into one heap and does not discard everything that it does not like for some reason. Thank you. I hope that this was short.